All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay in getting started here. We just ran into a few technical issues, but we are here now, and it's time to get started, so let's go. My name is Sean Keller. I'm with Local Futures. And before we get started, I'd like to just make sure that you can all hear me all right. So if you can hear me, please let me know by sending a message in the chat box on the right of the screen. Okay, cool. It looks like most of you can hear me just fine. If you run into any audio issues during the webinar, I am on hand and I will do my best to try and fix it. So write a message in the chat box if you need help at any point. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all to the 10th webinar in our Global to Local series. And we're here to talk about participatory democracy and an economy for the common good. And joining us for this task will be Christian Felber, author of the book Change Everything, Creating an Economy for the Common Good, and initiator of the Economy for the Common Good project. And also joining us is our own Helena Norberg-Hodge, director of Local Futures, producer and co-director of the documentary The Economics of Happiness, and author of the book Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh. So we will start with some short introductions from our speakers, talking a little about their work and their backgrounds, and then we'll move into probably 30 to 40 minutes of conversation between our speakers, after which we'll continue with a 45-minute question and answer period. So there's plenty of time to get questions ready. Feel free to type them into the chat box at any time, whenever you think of them, and I'll do my best to ask as many of them as possible during the Q&A period. If your internet connection runs into trouble, you can also call in and listen to the webinar by phone. The instructions on how to do that are included in your confirmation email, or you can click the info button above the chat box. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Christian and Helena.
Well, I want to, first of all, thank you, Christian, for joining us, and explain to those who are listening that I'm in a very hot Australia. It's evening here, but it's still very hot. And I imagine you're in a cold Austria. And and it's morning over there and night over here, so I'm a little bit tired, but I'm sure we'll have a good conversation. And I'm so glad that you could join us. I had invited you to speak at one of our conferences in Australia. I remember probably about 5 years ago. In the end, you couldn't make it. But I'm really glad that you're here, and so glad that your work is going so well. Because as far as we're concerned, changing everything is about changing the economy. Because changing the economy will mean that we change everything. So we'd love to hear, first of all, something about your work and your latest project.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helena, to you and to the Local Futures team. And hello, everybody. Welcome to this conversation between Helena, me, and you. It's right. 5 years ago, I was very interested in going to Australia and to get to know each other better, our initiatives, localization and an economy for the common good. Due to different reasons, amongst others, the ecological question. I would have gone only for that conference, and that was one of the reasons why I decided to wait for a webinar to start a deeper exchange. And it's correct, we have -6°C in Vienna at this moment, and it's still morning. So it's exactly the opposite of the climatic situation in Australia. But I think our mindsets are more similar than the climate outside.
And the weather, yeah.
And the weather. Yes, and in a preparatory conversation, we talked as a starting point for the economy for the common good and the sovereign democracy, to start with the power of transnational corporations and what to do about this. So this will be the path that leads me to the alternative. And I jump right into the issue with a step backward in history to the development of the present power of transnational corporations, because it's a quite recent phenomenon which developed parallelly to nowadays capitalism. Just a few figures. In 1800, there were only 200 corporations in the United States, and each of them had to apply for an individual license to have the allowance to be a corporation. That was the first step towards modern corporation. In the 19th century, the most important legal decisions were taken to empower corporations. One was to introduce limited liability in order that shareholders are not liable for the losses and damages that their property, their companies do to humans and to nature and to democracy, for instance. The most important decision was the conversion of corporations into legal persons in most countries, and in the United States, even in natural persons. That is a very surprising phenomenon, which met in his days, or in her days, a very strong resistance, but it was decided. And maybe a last but very interesting detail is that in the beginnings of corporations, they were not allowed to have property on other corporations or companies. And the only reason for that was the fear that corporations could become too powerful if they got that allowance. This is a very interesting detail, and it also was decided in the 19th century. And then other decisions in this directions towards progressive empowerment of corporations were taken. And maybe the last one was to give them a direct right to sue states in bilateral investment treaties if they feel unfairly treated or indirectly expropriated. This is a very creative invention of how to protect excessively private property and corporations. More if we recognize the fact that human rights are not even protected directly. Human rights are more important than private property or economic rights of corporations. But there is no international law that protects human rights directly if they are violated by these very same corporations. And nobody is even thinking about the protection against the indirect violation of human rights, because this would be the equivalent. We are not only protected against the direct violation of human rights, but we could even be protected against the indirect violation of human rights. This could be any political measure if a state lowers social welfare, for instance, or a corporation is doing any harm, really any harm to the environment, to public health, to democracy, or to human dignity. So if we had equivalence on the legal level, and more precisely in international law, then globalization and the economy would have a totally different face. On the other hand, the recognition of these legal facts lead me to a very clear consequence. The consequence is, if we want to change something about this legal state of the art, we have to act on the same level, which is the legal level and which is the level of international law. This is the conclusion that I've drawn. And another insight is, after 20 years of political engagement in different movements in Austria, is that for the next years, our dear governments and parliaments will not be ready to change something about this, about the excessive protection of private property, excessive rights and freedoms for transnational corporations, pseudo-liberal globalization, or an international free trade regime. That is why we thought about a change in the democratic system itself, which we call sovereign democracy. And sovereign democracy is understood literally. Sovereign comes from the Latin word soveranus and says literally to stand above all. And theoretically, in a democracy, it's the people who stand above all. But in fact, they don't. In fact, the governments and parliaments take the decisions. They even change constitutions, and they make the international law, and they decide free trade and free movement of capitals, even in tax havens, and they give unlimited power to transnational corporations. My conviction is, if people could take these decisions by themselves, they would decide differently. They would not establish a free trade regime. They would not, or they would link free movement of capital to tax cooperation and transparency, and they would limit the power not only of corporations, but they would limit inequality on all levels of the economy. But for that, they would need something what we call sovereign rights. Sovereign rights are a possible next development step in our democracies after individual human and fundamental rights. I think all of us love and appreciate individual human and fundamental rights, and maybe for many of us they are the highest goal of our policy ambitions. But we did not think so far about collective fundamental rights, and I call them sovereign rights. And these would be collective decisions which could correct or mandate our representatives in parliaments and governments. And I don't step too deep into this now. I just indicate that in a sovereign democracy, people would have, as the highest instance, the exclusive right to write and also to change the constitutions. They would turn into the constitutive power and mandate and control to a certain degree the legislative power, which remains the parliament as it is today, and also the executive power, which would be the government in the same way as today, but people would be above them. And if people could write constitutions and mandate or give the fundamental direction of all policy fields, economic policy, financial and monetary policy, or trade policy, they would for sure take different decisions. And one of them would be that they would limit inequality and power concentration. I'm totally sure about that. And in the international movement of the economy for the common good, we have developed a game which we call democracy, and we play this game with the people, and we invite them to imagine that they constitute a local constitutional assembly in which they have the right to discuss and to decide about the possible limitation of inequality. And if you take just one example, inequality in income, then people can first do a series of proposals which maximum multiple the highest income can reach in relation to the legal minimum wage, so the maximum difference. And the result usually is that people propose they propose very different alternatives, which you can see on the left side. They propose 4 times or 7 times or 10 times up to 1,000 times in one case. In another case, from 2 times to 50 times. Many times they also propose factor 1, which would mean total equality, or factor unlimited, which would be the state of the art today, decided by our governments. But when it comes to decision, and there we use a very helpful tool, which is called systemic consensus, which works in a way that all proposals are voted on, not only one proposal, but all proposals, and people don't show their affirmation, but the resistance against all proposals. And the proposal that meets the least resistance, which can be understood as that proposal that causes the least pain in the population or restricts liberty of all citizens together in the least possible degree, is the winner. And as you can see in these two examples, the maximum factor 10 is the winner. And this is a very frequent result from Sweden to Chile so far, in 25 countries, which means that the highest income could not be higher than 10 times the legal minimum wage in a national economy. Or, of course, if people decided in all countries that participate in an ethical trade regime, this would be also true for the world market or for all countries that participate in the world market. Just to compare, what are the decisions of some parliaments? These are the current facts for Sweden, Austria, Germany, and the US. And you see, this is very far from the preferences or the sense of justice of the citizens that participate in these games. And no matter if the winner is factor 10 or 20 or maybe 30, I'm very sure it would not be higher than 30, even if it would be 50. It's extremely far from what our parliaments have decided today, as you can see in the slide, between 600 times as the maximum multiplier, or even 360,000 times in the US. And it's just one example for the thesis that parliaments take different decisions than citizens would take if they could vote on fundamental questions directly. And as we will also talk about trade probably today, and it's a very burning issue in at least in Europe and US, but also in countries that are involved in TTP, which has just died, and which could be looking for an alternative now. If you give people not only the two alternatives, free trade or open trade and protectionism, but at least a third alternative, like for instance ethical trade, which does not mean that the more trade the better. Trade is an end in itself, that would be free trade. And it doesn't mean protectionism either, which has the meaning that trade is a bad thing and the less trade the better. But it considers trade as a means to achieve higher goals. Which goals? Well, again, starting from human rights and their full and reliable implementation, sustainable development, climate protection, cultural diversity, labor rights, just distribution, and social cohesion, just to name a few. And I teach also at Vienna University for Economics and Business. And most of my students are MBA students. And after dealing or after discussing about these three alternatives, at the moment of measuring resistance against all three, the result is that, of course, protectionism in the middle meets the highest resistance. But in the meaning, the less trade, the better. But very surprisingly, free trade meets also very high resistance. And in comparison, ethical trade doesn't meet any resistance. And this is a decision from MBA students, which are not the most progressive ones, because it's a very mainstream university. So this gives me a lot of hope that if people could vote directly on fundamental questions of international law, the trade system, the economic system, or the financial system, they would take fundamental decisions differently than our nowadays parliaments and governments. So on the one hand, I think I've given a short introduction into sovereign democracy and how to deal with power. On the other hand, I haven't talked about the economy for the common good, which would take me another 5 to 10 minutes. That's why I asked the moderator if I shall stop here, because time is over. Or
I think let's let Helena come in for to the conversation for a little bit, and then maybe we can switch back and you can talk about the economy for the common good.
Sure, let's do.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just really to comment on some slight differences in how we see things. I guess, one of my big concerns is that what we have in terms of global trade is the reality is that it's being dominated by and led by these giant corporations. And so until we deal with their power, the idea of ethical trade is a nice idea, but as long as we allow those giant players to essentially blackmail governments, because this is what's happening. They are telling governments, if you do anything to regulate us, we'll go elsewhere. And it's this ability to go elsewhere as a mobile business that we see as so problematic. People are also aware that Adam Smith was not assuming that capital would be mobile. And so it's the mobile capital, but it's actually the mobility of these enormous monopolistic institutions that threaten governments. And this is what happened after 2008. Everybody in the world knew that we needed some regulation in the world of finance, but we have not had regulation. We've had further deregulation. And it's because governments were saying, we can't, if we do anything to inhibit their power, they'll go elsewhere. So this mobility is the problem as far as I see, and that's of course linked to the enormous scale and power that they have. And that's why I'd be focusing more on the urgent, immediate need to have people vote with their voices to start with, and possibly in the streets, in terms of stopping the further deregulatory treaties. And I think when we ask people, if they prefer ethical trade or not, of course, I'm absolutely convinced, as you are, that if people had an opportunity to vote, they would be voting very differently from their governments, in complete agreement. But I think one of the things that has to happen first is that we need much more information about what trade actually means. Because the discussion in the media and most people think of it as the relationship between two countries, the relationship between Austria and the US, between US and China. But as we see it, for a very long time now, it's been about the relationship between Goldman Sachs, Monsanto, Coca-Cola, and virtually all the governments of the world. And we see governments worldwide having, out of fear, ignorance, blindness, moved towards greater and greater liberalization, greater and greater deregulation of these giants. So that to us is the urgent issue, and that it requires a global perspective, which I think we're beginning to get it. I mean, there is now enormous resistance to these trade treaties. It's very encouraging to see that. And I want to make the point that that resistance comes from people's movements, from trade unions and environmentalists having linked hands. It does not come from Mr. Trump or even from Bernie Sanders or anyone else. It's coming from the grassroots. However, political leaders, now are beginning, to mouth their opposition, we can be quite sure that it's not coming, obviously, from Trump, in any way the same concerns that the people have. So I think, where we're in complete agreement is people need to have more of a say. I believe that part of that process, and I think that's partly what you're doing, with the games and so on, requires much more engagement on the part of civil society to be more aware of what's actually going on. And I'm glad we're doing this webinar. I wish we could reach more people. It will be replayed and so on, because access to this information is extremely difficult. I mean, in the mainstream media, we now find a semblance of a discussion about globalization and trade, but it is so slanted. And above all, it almost never discusses the excessive power of these global corporations. And you know, a lot of people are afraid of that. I also think that in terms of the way forward, using the term localization to me is sort of essential in terms of the sort of basic concept is that every business needs to be registered in a society and adhere to the rules of that society. And you were looking at some of those rules, you know, in terms of the the gap between the salaries in different countries and what citizens would want. So these rules need to be determined by society, and that means that businesses have to be localized. They have to belong to a place in order to even think of adhering to the rules determined by civil society. If we allow them as businesses to move freely, then of course our ethical rules will no longer apply. And then we have this situation of blackmailing. So this is why, for me, it's very important that we understand that localizing is not just about doing things at the very local level. It's not just about what we might do at the scale of a community or even at the scale of a city. However, what is important is to realize that when it comes to most of the supply of basic needs, in particular food, we should be looking at a very dramatic shift towards more localized, more regional food economies, where every people, every country, every region should have the right to focus on producing a diversity of food products to meet their basic needs by reducing CO2 emissions, increasing job opportunities, and of course, shortening the distances means less packaging, less plastic. I mean, it's really a solution multiplier. And maybe I should just mention right now, while I think of it, we've just done a 2-minute video where we lay out some of the basic schematic arguments for moving forward. And, you know, we're calling it localization, the solution multiplier. And I hope people will look at our video. It's on our website and it's on our Facebook page. Just 2 minutes, and we want to do a series where we lay out more. Also, the differences between, you know, local in terms of local food, and the local, which would, you know, in many cases, an industry that's producing bicycles or whatever it might be, trains, or there is an efficiency of scale, and that's likely to be at the national level. And if I could also quickly add, I think both you and I are probably in agreement that many of those industries don't need to be government controlled. What we need is rules set through the democratic process. But then there is a great deal of scope for private enterprise, for real entrepreneurship, creativity, flexibility. And this is such an important message because, you know, particularly in the big business world, people are petrified of regulation and they have this deep prejudice, you know, against government bureaucracy and interference. So this is, you know, how they push blindly for greater liberalization. But there's so little discussion about the difference between privatizing upwards into this ozone layer of interlinked banks and corporations that are almost now a de facto government, a global government. And I think we need to draw that on our charts, you know, to get it clearly into our head what we need to do to break up that monopolistic centralized power, and that we don't need to go to the extremes of saying, you know, only gift economy or only co-ops or, you know, only, you know, no private property. There is a place and there is a scope for a certain degree of wealth accumulation, a certain degree of interest, I believe. And certainly, if nothing else, as a transition, I think we have to, in order to build up a powerful enough movement, I think that kind of approach is going to appeal to more people. Do you agree with that, Christian?
Yeah, let's let Christian respond, and then since we're talking about the economy a lot, maybe then after Christian responds, we can go back and talk about the economy for the common good.
Yeah, let's see if there is a disagreement. All right, thanks. Yeah, how's the difference, if there is any? I fully agree with you, Helena, that the first step is to stop the current attempts to deepen the free trade regime. We are lucky persons because TTP has just died. TTIP is tumbling, and CETA will probably not pass through all 40 parliaments of member states of the European Union and even some regional parliaments. And
can I just interrupt? Sorry, Christian, really quickly. Is there? Could you turn your microphone up just a little bit? It might not be quite loud enough for everyone to.
Let's
hear.
see. I try to turn the microphone up.
Sean, is my sound good for a change?
Yeah, it's fine.
Oh, good.
If it's not possible, that it's okay.
I try to speak up a bit.
Okay, no problem.
Is enough?
Thank you. It sounds good to me. It sounds good to me. Yeah.
Is it now louder? Because now I did something. Let's see.
Maybe a little bit, but let's keep going. Don't want to take too much time away from the discussion.
Okay, so back to the recent death of TTP. It's not the merit of Trump, of course, because people's coalitions have prepared the no TTP for more than 6 years, especially in the United States. And I totally agree that we need to build up people's movements to stop any further free trade or investment agreement. I myself was a co-founder of ATTAC in Austria, and I worked more than 10 years for ATTAC, which plays now a key role in stopping CETA TTIP in Europe. On the other hand, as soon as we will have stopped the current attacks and attempts to deepen the free trade regime, like these three, then we will still be in the free trade regime of the World Trade Organization, with its more than 60 treaties that are still into force. So we are still in the heavy rain, although we managed to stop TTIP and CETA, and that's why I just wrote this book about the ethical world trade regime, which will be in German in March, and which of course goes back. Yes. Sorry, I did not get this. Helena, can you repeat?
I don't think she said anything.
I couldn't hear part of what you said, and you can hear what Christian is saying.
Okay, yeah, your audio just cut out for a second, Christian, but not to worry.
Okay, well, so yeah, first step, stop the current attacks and attempts, and then the second step, what is our proposal if we manage to defeat CETA, TTIP, or even in the midterm or long term, the World Trade Organization? And one of the elements of an ethical trade regime is to put it into the UN and to put it in coherence with human rights agreements and with labor rights and with the rights of nature and with sustainable development and with cultural diversity and localization. I fully agree that localization is not just about decentralization. It's much more. And one element that you just mentioned, Helena, is democratization and give the control over economic power back to the people, control over corporations. That's why I introduced with the progressive empowerment of corporations in the last 200 years. And of course, if people got the power back over corporations, they would have to take away some of these powers. I agree that it's not about the abolition of private property, but it's about the de-empowerment and the regulation of private property and corporations directly through the people. First step could be that we take away their protection against indirect expropriation. Those ISDS, investor state dispute settlement rights, first step. Another step could be only if they remain within a maximum size, which could be, just to give one concrete proposal, between 10 and 50 billion dollars or euros turnover per year. Only then they are allowed to participate in a world trade regime. A third condition could be that they only are allowed to participate in a world trade regime if they do a common good balance sheet next to the financial balance sheet. And the common good balance sheet measures in measurable points to which degree a company contributes to the common good in all aspects, from human rights to climate protection. And those companies with a bad performance, they will go bankrupt. Whereas the best performers in ethical terms, they will be able to survive. Then we have smaller companies, we have less powerful companies, and we have more ethical companies, because unethical companies would not be able to survive in such a trade system. And a last remark about property, maybe. We are so blind that most of us don't see that the current trade and investment protection treaties, when they talk about protecting property, they're only protecting private property. But there are so many different types of property. There is public property, there can be social or collective property, there are commons, and there can be no property at all. If we look at nature, for instance, there could be protection rights instead of any kind of property. And a holistic trade agreement, in my vision, is first within the United Nations. It takes into consideration from human rights to the special needs of poorer countries. And it takes into consideration all types of property. And it protects legally commons and nature and the rights of nature in the same degree as it protects private property, which is just one type of property and which has to be limited and conditioned, as Helena has already said. I fully agree with that. And I think on a theoretical basis, we all agree with this, but we have to get it somehow to the legal base. Because until we don't have it on the legal base, corporations will still be big and powerful, and they will still be able to blackmail governments, and they will still be able to shape globalization as they're doing today. So that's why maybe the point of touch is of localization and an ethical economy is democratization and empower the people and not the corporations. And of course, we know that this is an extremely ambitious vision. And that's why the proposal to start such a process, such a sovereign and constitutional process, is at the local level. And the prototype that we have developed is a local assembly at the level of towns, villages, or communities. And the idea is that people discuss about a certain policy field, like, for instance, economic policy or monetary and financial policy or trade policy. And they only debate about the 10 to maybe 20 most fundamental questions. They discuss in different alternatives, and then they decide over these alternatives. And of course, at the local level, they cannot change the constitution, let alone international law. But if there are hundreds or thousands local assemblies, they could define delegates which go to higher levels and assemblies at higher levels. At least I'm thinking of the European Union. They could make proposals to change the trade policy, the external economic policy of the European Union, which are then finally voted by the citizens and not by their valuable and helpful governments for laws, but not for constitutions. Again, I talked more than 10 minutes. Please, Stine, help me how to proceed.
I think if you want, I think we could spend maybe 5 minutes talking some about the economy for the common good. If you would like, okay. I can pull that presentation back.
Please, be so kind. Then,
sure.
Okay, I give you the quickest crash course possible on economy for the common good. Just an introductory remark. The core of the proposal is to orient all economic activities towards the common good. And this idea is not a new one. It comes from many different cultures. Aristotle is just one example. It's not his intellectual property. It could be in the same way Buen Vivir in Latin America. It could be Ubuntu from Africa. It could be Dharma from the Buddhist philosophy, or it could be a feminist view on the economy in any part of the world. But the point is that the goal of the economy shall be the common good, or if you want to, no matter how you want to call it, good life, life quality, right livelihood, or general welfare. And oikonomia, as we're talking about this term, already contains this meaning. This is the good message, because it comes from the ancient Greek oikos, and the oikos refers to the household. And the goal of a human household is obviously the well-being of all its members. And if you understand by oikos the bigger house, the natural household or nature, then the goal of oikonomia would be sustainable development. And ironically, I often say the true economists are either mothers or farmers. And the best economists are farming mothers, of course. But this just to try to get back the original meaning of economy and to put it in opposition to what we are practicing today. What we are practicing today does not have to do anything with economy in its original meaning. It's klimatistike, which is a term by Aristotle, and which is literally in ancient Greek the art of making money and to get rich. Both is possible, but what most people would prefer is economy. We don't even need to add for the common good because it's contained, but which is in opposition to klimatistike or capitalism. The good message is that the common good as the overarching goal for economic activities is already enshrined in many constitutions without any exception. And the role of capital or money is just to be the means. And this relationship, which is the goal and which is the means, is absolutely decisive at the moment of measuring success in the economy. Today, in capitalistic economy, we measure success alongside GDP at the level of the national economy, with a financial profit at the level of companies, and with the return of investment at the level of investments. And all three are monetary indicators, and all three turn money into the goal of economic activities, because success usually is measured alongside the achievement of the goal, but not primarily at the level of the accumulation of means. This is the big confusion or contradiction. In the current economy, we are not measuring success alongside the achievement of the goal. This would be like this. If we agree, of course, that the common good is the goal of all economic activities, then we would have to measure success with a common good product, a common good balance sheet, or a common good exam for investments. Because it's more important to know which is the impact of an investment on nature, on human relationships, on communities, on democracy, or other collective values, than to know if an investment brings along a financial return. That's also important to know, but it's less important to know than the impact of an investment on the common goods and the fundamental values. And that's why the common good exam is more important than the ROI, and the common good balance sheet is more important than the financial balance sheet, and the common good product is more important than the GDP, or even could replace it. So how could a common good balance sheet look like? Of course, you can discuss indefinitely about the operationalization and the concrete method. Our suggestion is that we take the most frequent fundamental values of democratic societies, which is in the horizontal orange line, from human dignity to democracy, and we measure in points to which degree a company adheres and fulfills these fundamental values towards all of its stakeholders on the vertical orange line, from suppliers to future generations. And the result should be measurable and visible, first for consumers and investors, that they really have a choice because they know the ethical performance of a certain company or investment. And second, and more importantly, lawmakers could link the results of a common good balance sheet to a series of incentives. And the goal of these incentives is that the products and services of ethical companies become cheaper to consumers and investors than the products and services of less ethical companies. And that's why the less ethical companies, they pay so high taxes and so high tariffs that they go bankrupt if they decide and continue to be unethical companies, and they would not get even access to a world market in an ethical trade regime. Just for instance, if inequality remains high, if they continue to have an excessive ecological footprint, or if they discriminate against a minority or corrupt democracy, just for instance. By the way, the movement started 6 years ago in Austria and other European countries, and today there are more than 2,000 companies that support our initiative, and 400 companies have implemented the balance sheet concretely. So it's not only an idea, it's a movement. And the Bank for the Common Good is also for today a cooperative with almost 5,000 cooperativists, and it has already developed the Common Good exam for investments, and it brings together investors and ethical companies that are searching for financiation. And the more important check of an investment or a loan request is its ethical consequences, as already mentioned. Again, a huge corporation would not get a loan at all. A small company or local company with a bad ethical performance because it discriminates against women, for instance, or doesn't care about the environment, will get a very expensive loan. And the local company, just to be illustrative, which has an excellent ethical performance, will get a zero interest or even a negative interest loan from the Bank for the Common Good. And thanks to this, of course, this is the shortest possible crash course on economy for the common good, which is a bit more complex. The idea is to change the rules of the game from, we call that for profit orientation and counter petition, acting against each other, to contributing to the common good as the highest goal, and cooperating with other companies, which is also rewarded positively in the common good balance sheet. Well, I tried to be as short as possible. That's it.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
We have some questions already, but Helena, I don't know if you want to take maybe 2 minutes to respond, or if we should go straight questions.
Well,
it's up to you.
Well, just very quickly, why I do believe that decentralization is so important is that if we imagine a town, determining a town of maybe no more than 1 million people, having its accounts clear in terms of progress, so that if there were a GDP or a common good measurement, or what some people call, well, there are all kinds of attempts to come up with other indices. If it were clearly visible what was happening, there's no way that the number could rise if all the trees were clear cut or if all the water was polluted. But what we're dealing with is operating at a scale where we don't see the impact of what we're doing. And so I'm also very keen that we look at ways of decentralizing and realizing that part of the problem is, even with the best of intention, even with a common good index, if you're operating at a national level where it's impossible to actually see clearly the impact of actions, it's going to be very difficult to implement any sort of mechanisms for holding companies accountable and so on. And that's why I saw someone asking now about the triple bottom line. And I sort of suspect also the companies now who are following the common good indices that, they're operating within a system where it is virtually impossible to be truly ethical and to be, at every step ecologically as well as socially accountable and in a truly demonstrable way. So scale is of fundamental importance. So I think we need to introduce also mechanisms to ensure that people at the regional and local level have far more say, even in terms of the actual indices that they choose and the ways of measuring. I mean, this becomes when you're working in non-Western countries and you're dealing with this tremendous diversity of languages, you're dealing with a tremendous diversity of species, and there it becomes so obvious that we need to respect local experiential knowledge much more. And the experiential knowledge is knowledge that's based on being able to see more clearly your impact or your business's impact on the environment and on other people. So I think you're tending, Christian, to think at the level of the national scale, which we also need to do. I mean, we're needing multiple layers here. And I want to comment on a question I see up there about someone, Sebastian, was asking, if the UK were to try to go at this alone and implement a very different strategy, how likely is it that they could succeed, in a world with such huge, powerful forces, not just this lobby of interlinked banks and corporations, but a US government which is using its military to support that expansion of neoliberal capitalism. So I feel there that we should be encouraging the idea of what I call a breakaway strategy. We should be looking at the vision of encouraging several nations to link together to move away from the dominant agenda. So we can't really, within the current context, only look at what do we do within inside the nation state. And so I think we need to be encouraging people's movements that make every effort they can to interact internationally, to exchange information, and to build up a common agenda in terms of how we deal with the interlinked corporate lobby. And it's to some extent it's already happened that certain countries have got together to stand up against the pressures of the dominant system. But I think in our vision and in our articulating these issues, it's very important that we make it clear that this internationalization, this, I don't like to call it globalization because it confuses people, but this collaboration at the international level is vital. And that's also why I worry about ecologically minded and socially minded people saying, oh, I'm not going to travel. I mean, I understand it on the one hand, but on the other hand, I am a great advocate of us doing as much as we can to exchange information internationally, even to meet at convergences and conferences, as we do in Local Futures. We organize international conferences around the world to try to bring that international perspective and to create a cross-country dialogue. We are particularly keen that there be a deeper dialogue between the global north and the global south, because that's where there is such a lack of understanding and information. But that was probably more than 2 minutes. So now we should go to some questions.
Yes, and in fact, you already addressed one of them, which was the question from Sebastian about if the UK or one country were to decide to leave neoliberalism behind, would the rest of the world sanction them and be able to force them back into it? So I'll ask that to Christian now and see if you have anything to add.
No, there wouldn't. And there is already an example, but let me start from the beginning. First, again, I agree that, of course, the local indices or the regional or national indices have to, that's our proposal, should be composed by each region. So there is no global standard. That's very important.
Oh, good, good.
It's
good.
It's a genuine product of local democracy. And of course, the indices can differ from each other.
Excellent.
No problem at all. On the contrary, they should be the
Actually,
yes.
what I would like to add there, though, is that the complexity that we're dealing with is that when it comes to certain ecological standards in particular, we do need a certain collaboration on agreeing on essentially a level above which countries agree not to go, you know, whether it's in terms of CO2 emission, it's in terms of other forms of pollution, because there, what you do at the local level can have an impact at the global level. So that there's when it comes to the ecological protection, we need a very, very strong umbrella of protection. You know, in effect, we need to reverse what we have now, which is the WTO making, you know, as you were saying, you know, monetarized economy primary, and the real economy, the natural world, is subjugated and invisible. We need to turn that around and demand a WEO, a World Environment Organization, where we agree, civic society agrees on certain standards, an umbrella under which you operate. And under that umbrella, there is an enormous scope for diversity, but there needs to be that protection, essentially. Yeah.
Again, I agree. The turnaround is in that trade, which in the World Trade Organization is an end in itself, and everything else, like nature or the climate, is a non-trade concern, and that's why it's not protected in the same degree. Has to be switched around. That human rights and sustainable development and the right of an autonomous development and social and the like should become the goals. And trade is just a means which we like if it helps to achieve the goals, but which we can restrict and limit if it endangers the goals. That's exactly the putting into its place of trade in the idea of an ethical trade regime. Second good message, we already do have UK, which is Bhutan. Not all countries are members of the World Trade Organization. We have almost 200 nations and only 170 something members of the World Trade Organization. And the story of how Bhutan did not become a member of the World Trade Organization is very interesting, because they do have a common good product already. They call it GNH, gross national happiness, and it measures human well-being in non-monetary terms, but in aspects that really matter for a good life and for life quality. And that is a replacement, and a better replacement, of GDP to measure the success of the nation or of a region. But they also derived from that GNH a screening tool to evaluate political measures in order to know if the legal project is a good or a bad idea. And they were before the decision to join the World Trade Organization, and spontaneously 2/3 of the cabinet, which is the government of Bhutan, was in favor of entering the World Trade Organization. But then they applied the screening tool, and the screening tool did not only ask about the development of the volume of trade and maybe the development of the income per capita in dollars, but it also asked about human well-being, quality of relationships, stability of communities, environmental stability, cultural diversity, democracy, and so on and so forth. And after applying the screening tool, 2/3 of the cabinet voted against Bhutan's entrance into the World Trade Organization, so it's still outside. And as far as I know, no war has been started against Bhutan. And I'm quite sure that...
actually, I should maybe say something, because I worked in Bhutan over a 5-year period, and also, as maybe some people don't know, for 40 years in Ladakh, which is a sort of a similar area. But Ladakh belongs politically to India. Unfortunately, Bhutan, in effect, also belongs politically to India. You know, the Indian government has huge influence, and unfortunately, in the last election, they played. You know, one thing I wanted to mention is the role of the media. Also, we have a corporate media that makes it very difficult, really, for any government to remain independent anymore, because we have a globalized corporate media that dramatically influences the political theater, and they had quite a strong influence in Bhutan. And the new prime minister is not as keen on GNH. So there are huge economic pressures, particularly from India, that make it, you know, very difficult. But you know, there's still an attempt, and it's a very inspiring example. I haven't seen our film, The Economics of Happiness. We talk about it in the film, in the film, The Economics of Happiness, also.
Inspiring. I think that's what we can take from Bhutan.
Yes.
Just a tiny.
And I do want to say that I think that however how much people know about Italy, people need to know that it was a people's movement that was able to go into parliament and take 30% of the vote, and that this people's movement took 6 years to build up. Now, everything is not perfect about it, but it's a very, very inspiring example of a people's movement gaining tremendous power and influence in a very short time. And this is despite media working against it, you know, 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
So there are inspiring examples around the world.
There are. And the same people movement in Italy prevented public water supply from being privatized, just for instance. And as for the media, just a tiny remark, one of the 20 cornerstones of the economy for the common good is to turn media into a public good, which would mean, amongst others, that no person, no legal and no natural person can have ownership in more than 1 or 2 media, and that no media is allowed to be dependent from another economic power to a higher degree than, let's say, 1 or 2%, and so on and so forth. But I would like to go back to UK briefly. I think if UK really decided, thanks to a democratic process, to start an ethical trade regime, or the European Union, why not? because the majority of the citizens of the European Union do not agree with the external trade policy of the European Union. So I think it's possible that a citizens movement within the European Union will suggest that the European Union steps out of the World Trade Organization and offers UN members, and we have seen that 30 members of the United Nations can start an initiative. The best example are the human rights covenants. The human rights covenants started with 30 nations only. So it was not necessary that the whole world agreed on something in order to start it. And obviously we have a similar idea that a group of beginners is sufficient, where maybe people have more to say, or bring their governments to opt for ethical trade, or to regulate corporate power, or to turn media into public good, or to localize the economy, and then join an ethical trade agreement between nations from different continents, or starting with one continent. I think these could be the alternatives which we should envision and at least propose, although they seem very ambitious and utopian for the moment. But the first step, and where the full freedom have, is to propose them. And maybe one day governments will recognize that neither free trade nor protectionism are a good idea, but something in between, which allows local development, diversity, as you mentioned, and which is my favorite picture, to use trade only as the salt in the soup. But the soup is the local economy.
That's a great picture. I do want to get to more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because we have maybe 20 minutes left, and a few questions. One of which is a really big one, so I'm going to ask it first. I'm going to jump around a little. The question is from James, and he's asking. He agrees that action is needed at all scales, but he says, I think that the neoliberal agenda is most vulnerable at the local scale. What kinds of actions do you envision as priorities at the local level?
Well, we have in our organization a range of materials and also in our workshops to help people rebuild local economies and to rebuild the community fabric. So we recommend, first of all, changing the I to a we. Connecting with other people is fundamental. We've been trained to think of ourselves as these isolated individuals, and there's enormous pressure on us to buy our way out of the crisis, buy the products that are going to save the environment. No, we need to come together to make change. And at the community level, when we start thinking as a we, even if it's just with 2 or 3 other people, we can start making changes that have far more meaning, both for us personally, because they already start to create more energy, more optimism when people are not isolated on their own. So, well, once we start thinking more as a community, we urge people to focus on food as the highest priority. And don't be fooled into thinking that just because there might be a farmer's market in your town, that's enough. We're in a situation now where our governments, that includes my native government of Sweden, are locked into an economic trajectory where every day the distance between the farm and the food we eat is growing. And it's growing because of these enormous intermediaries, these enormous globalized corporations. And they can only deal in monoculture. They can't deal with diversity. So shortening distances is a way of helping farmers to become more ecological by being able to diversify, even if only a little bit. And it's essential. If we have crises, climate crises, financial crises, the first thing that's going to be the issue is food. The supermarket shelves will be empty in a few days. So there is a sort of an emergency situation, but there is also an incredibly inspiring, positive local food movement growing globally. And I hope that all of you who are listening, that you'll connect to that, find out what's happening in your area, connect to it, support it, or start new initiatives. It's an awakening of the soul. It's a spiritual journey that brings happiness immediately. And it's a journey that does not have to require lots of money. It will require a bit of time. And my big concern today is that the dominant system is robbing us of time, because it's the economic trajectory is encouraging businesses at every level to use energy and technology instead of people. And in areas, particularly in education, in healthcare, even in farming, and in actually most endeavors, it's a disaster. It means we have an escalation of pollution and CO2 emissions and massive job insecurity. And the trajectory right now is in the direction of robots. And we are being told that we're going to be seeing even, bigger, enormous job losses. So waking up to this and seeing how we at the community level can start demonstrating economic activity more job rich at a slower pace, at a human scale, and it builds community, it's more ecological. So it really is a solution multiplier. Beyond food, supporting local business alliances. There are networks now around the world where smaller independent local businesses are linking together and linking with the consumers. There is an increase in really healthy cooperatives. So the businesses are another important step, although I would always urge people to start with food. And then there is also in the area of banking. I mean, Christian was part of starting a bank. I remember you were just thinking about it when I last saw you in Austria. And these initiatives are happening around the world. Some of the simpler, smaller ones involve just a group of people, a community group, putting together some resources, sometimes only a few $1,000s, but to support the movement towards healthier, localized economies. And, very often they will help to, sometimes they'll lend money interest-free to a community group that wants to buy a bit of land for a community park or for a community farm, a CSA. Sometimes they help to set up a community house where people can meet and interact. So there are many, many tools, many avenues, and please do go to our website and look at our materials to find out more about what you can do to start things at the local level. It's certainly a very rich and very inspiring area to focus on. But we mustn't do only that. We also need to focus on the policy level. This is the hard work in our organization, to remind people that we also need to be what I call education activists, getting the word out to build up the movements, the people's movement.
So maybe take over
What
here.
do you, Christian? What?
Yes, you already described many facets of a whole mosaic of possibilities, how to engage locally, food and energy and business alliances. I would add transition towns, which is an excellent movement in this direction. I would add the commons movement to think and to practice property or collectivity in a different way on a local level. And from our movement, I would add the common good municipalities. That's how we call them. There are already about 24 of them in different countries. And they do a series of projects. One is that they do the common good balance sheet for the public companies, for their own local municipal companies. And they invite all private businesses to do the same. And then they promote them and reward them. And that's now endangered by the free trade regimes, because local municipalities are no longer allowed to give priority nor to local companies, neither to ethical companies. So this is one of 100 arguments against free trade agreements and investment agreements. And after that, common good municipalities, they start with citizens' assemblies in 2 rounds. In the first round, they create their local common good index. So they define what really matters in the public space in all policy fields, and then they have their local G&H or Good Life Index or Common Good Index, and then it's easier to evaluate all further political measures according to what you really want to achieve, but which has defined by yourselves, by the local people. And the highest step, which is the policy step on the local level, is to discuss and decide about the big systems, the economy, the financial system, the trade regime, and international law. Again, although that's not in the political competence of municipalities, towns, and villages, that's not necessary. The point is that people start to involve and to demand their right to influence global policies, but they start the process on the local level. If you wait that top-down comes the solution, I think we can wait forever. If we start by ourselves, bottom-up, maybe we will not be heard by our national parliaments tomorrow, but if dozens and hundreds and thousands of municipalities start these local constituent processes, talking about constitutions and international agreements and their opinion about and their preferences about a different trade regime, a different economic system, a different financial system, one day they will be heard by parliaments and governments, and one day we will start formal processes that will change constitutions and international agreements.
Yeah.
So someone also mentioned.
I think,
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that having started something, I was one of the founders of something called the International Forum on Globalization. And that was back in the 90s, about 91 that we started. And, you know, there's been such a long period of, yes, raising awareness, and there were those protests at the WTO meeting in Seattle. But what's happened in the last 5-6 years in terms of awareness about the trade treaties is far more people realize. So I think that, you know, these changes may not be so far off as we think. I think, you know, right now, someone just wrote to me today that what's happening on the world stage really means that there are very few people anymore who can have faith in the dominant system. You know, I think people are really ready to question the whole system and to understand that we need that systemic shift. And so it really, I mean, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish because we're up against huge forces, there's a momentum, but once we recognize how the momentum from the top down, which now means that it's been reduced to 8 men have more wealth, monetarized wealth, but have more wealth than half the global population. This incredible injustice and gap between rich and poor. We're facing, you know, cataclysmic climate change. You know, we're at a point where we so urgently need to recognize that the dominant system fundamentally cannot support nature or people. And at a structural level, it's because it has to promote monoculture. And monoculture is death. You know, we need systems that are adapted, techno-economic systems that are adapted to diversity. It's that simple. And I think, you know, there is a big waking up going on, and I believe that we may see it within the next 4 or 5 years, and, you know, much bigger changes in a positive direction. Right now, it may not look that way. But in our work internationally, we are so heartened by seeing everywhere, even in China, I mean, India, all around the world, people power and the initiatives at the local level, which testify to goodwill from people, to the desire to build community, the desire to connect, the desire to do the right thing by nature. I wanted also to comment on someone just quickly asked about land reappropriation as part of the localization agenda. It's important, but I think some people are not aware of the multitude of possibilities. So, for instance, I now, there are many initiatives where even, some big landowners are now willingly allowing people to come in and grow food that they themselves then harvest and use. There are, CSAs where communities are actually buying land or supporting farmers in advance. There's a diversity of approaches. Land reappropriation, of course, is an important part of it. But I think sometimes when people, imagine that the change has to be too dramatic, then nothing happens. It's really useful to look at the multitude of initiatives that are happening that may require a less dramatic initiative.
Yeah. So there are definitely a lot of possibilities out there. I want to get to a couple of small, less broad questions before we end. Mostly for Christian. Altus asks, wouldn't you agree that a democratic workplace by means of worker cooperatives will automatically implement many of the principles that you're discussing by means of existing international cooperative laws?
Don't know if I got the question right. If a network of cooperatives would implement democratic structures worldwide, if they were protected by international law promoting cooperatives, sure, that would be a great idea. And one part of the proposals I made before, that international agreements would have to protect different types of properties. But very importantly, that would be not enough if private property still would be protected in the same excessive way as it is today. So it would have to go hand in hand with a depowerment of private property and for-profit companies, with a maximum size of for-profit companies, with a common good balance sheet for all companies. Maybe that's a bit a painful point, because although most of the shareholder companies we know, they have poorer ethical performance than cooperatives, it's possible that an exceptional shareholder companies has a better ethical performance than a cooperative. And although the typical cooperative has a much better ethical performance than the typical shareholder company, it can be the other way around. So I think at least as important as promoting diversity in types of property and in legal forms of companies is to oblige all properties, all types of property, to prove what they are doing for the common good, to do a common good balance sheet. And then all shareholder companies that harm the common good will go bankrupt, but also only those cooperatives that really enhance the common good will be able to survive. So I think it's a bunch of measures, but of course one of these measures is to pronounce and create an international law that protects collective property, commons, and cooperatives concretely.
Great. And one more question for you. This is from Anat, asking, so you talked about shifting from profit orientation to the common good. But the question is, in the economy for the common good, wouldn't financial profit also be the ultimate goal, only it would be achieved through the value system and actions which promote the common good? I guess, could you clarify the balance between financial profit, or I guess, financial stability of a institution or a nation state, yes, versus the common good?
Capitalism, Krematistik, financial profit is the highest goal, and everything else is a means or a side effect. Economy, actually, economy for the common good. The common good and companies' contribution to it becomes the goal, and capital or money only a means. in the economy for the common good, money or capital or profit cannot be the ultimate goal, because if you put money over the environment, relationships, democracy, and so on, you will lose, you will go bankrupt. So it's excluded as the ultimate goal. As a side effect of contributing in a maximum degree to the ultimate goal, which is the common good in all its aspects, you still will be profitable. You will still be able to survive, but in a smaller size, cooperating with other companies, respecting nature, and so on and so forth. That is one part of the answer. And the second part of the answer is that in the 4 types of the way we define an economy, which could be, let's put it on this side, self-sufficiency, gift economy, market economy, and a planned economy. In these 4 possible types, the economy for the common good is a kind of market economy on a monetary base. That's true. But in difference to the current capitalistic and counterpetitive competition market economy, it's a fully ethical market economy. It's a truly liberal, watch out, in the liberal meaning of the word, same rights, same freedoms, and same opportunities for everybody. And it's a redimensioned market economy, because we propose ecological human rights on the one hand, which mean that no person, no human being, no matter if she or he is citizen from the US, from Austria, or from Kenya, is allowed to consume more natural resources than the planet is giving to each human being. This would be a strategy to shrink market economy, and it would go hand in hand with the shrinking of the time we dedicate in the market economy. To put it very simply, from 40 hours per week to 20 hours per week. So it's also a redimensioned market economy, and the remaining 20 hours we gain for our local, both economic, social, and personal activities, which can be self-sufficiency, which can be activities of gift economy, of local cooperative and collaborative networks, or which can be just more time for ourselves and for our beloved. That's also part of the whole idea of an economy for the common good.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
We're officially supposed to end now, but yeah.
I just wanted to quickly say to Margarita, I understand you must understand English, but I completely agree with you. Of course, this is what we're seeing, is that so many people are not aware of the connections in the system and why the big picture is needed. And that goes contrary to a lot of what we're told, which is, the sort of agenda in terms of climate change has been to tell people, don't drive your car, don't go on holiday, you're destroying the world. And there has not been enough discussion about how the economic transition of shifting production to China, transporting things 3 times around the world, how the production side changing is the main reason why CO2 emissions have escalated and why they're continuing to escalate. So the big picture is really essential for us to look at what are really meaningful actions that we can take as citizens. Thank you for pointing that out in Spanish. And thank you so much, Christian. Really appreciate that you could join us. And I look forward to further collaboration between Local Futures and Economy for the Common Good.
Yeah, the same from my side. And obviously, there's for deepening discussion, and we will consider to offer a further webinar on these issues. Yeah. Just as a promise, because now I see so many questions which remain unanswered. We will save them and offer something for further space of debate and conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
And Sean,
thank you.
Sean, thank you so much too for your. We should see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks to both of you, and thank you to everyone who came here today. Thanks for asking great questions and driving this discussion forward. Just want to say Finally, I will send an email to all of you with the recording of the webinar, so you can watch it again, share it with your friends, whatever you want, and that'll be up very soon.
Or ask the questions directly. I promise to answer all of them that will remain unanswered today.
On the YouTube thread, or?
Well, if you send an email to all participants, you can add my email address, and of course the date of common good, and so people can contact us directly.
Wonderful. All right, sounds great. Let me see. Yeah, I'll also send a transcript of the chat to everyone because there was some good discussion going on there. And just want to note, we will be back next month with another webinar. With we're going to talk about climate change with Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, and I'll send you the details about that as well if you would like to join us. And yeah, thanks again everyone for being here. Hope to stay in touch with all of you and maybe see some of you next month or at a future webinar. And with that, I think we'll end things.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.